It's a show about this kind of a samurai who wants to. I think he has to defeat like a big demon, and he wants to. He gets no before he defeats the demon, he gets sent into the future, and it was kind of at its time was like outstanding show because it had like a very unique style, and the almost all the episodes were entirely silent, or not silent, but they only had sound or dialogue. And then in the end, but his gimmick is he wants to get back to the past. And then they finally did like a final episode of it, and there he in the final season he falls in love, and then he has the ability to get back to the past, and he has to give up the woman he loves to arrive back into the past, basically, right? Um, that's the gimmick of the show. Um, but the problem with that is, of course, that what you really want to talk about with a show like that is that you want the people to, or the samurai to learn that he can't go back to the past, that he has to settle with the present and improve the present, right? Like what we are doing here is kind of like not trying to get back, or what I'm doing here and what you're hopefully helping me with here is not trying to get back to the past of Germany. It's trying to settle with the present and just use the past to understand where we came to.
That's
And
one of the
it's just
what's.
something I feel kind of amiss. What?
Oh no, nothing. You were on it. I was just gonna say almost exactly what you said.
Yeah, and that is kind of like the tragedy, right? So it's like in the show they kind of pull it off exactly in the wrong order. He gives up the woman he loves so he can go to the past, which he misses so much. When in reality you have to let go of the past, which you wanted to get to be with the woman you love, basically, and be with the present that is will turn out to be much more beautiful and filled with hope and so on and so forth.
That was a there was a
Okay.
actually God,
Huh?
what was that guy's Woody Allen? I think it's Woody Allen that that American director that's always getting that he's got a little, sort of a lurid sexual history, but he made a movie. It's called Midnight in Paris, and it's about a novelist who's like a novelist in the mid 2000s who's he's smitten with like sort of golden age thinking is the film's term for it about the lost generation writers of the early 1920s, and then of course he wanders back in time to the to this his own supposed golden age, and when he gets there he finds that he falls in love with a woman who's like of similar interests to him, and he discovers that she is herself smitten with this concept of a slightly earlier generation as being the the unreachable golden age. It's a really pretty
Oh,
common trope. Interesting bit about Samurai Jack, though. You may get yeeted from YouTube for mentioning it because it apparently was created by a Russian, and that is not. It is apparently it is not okay currently to acknowledge anything that Russians have ever done.
true. Okay, so let's start this episode because I see somebody in chat, so I know that this is
It's
happening now for YouTube.
yeah,
Just for
it's working.
clarification, last time YouTube cut off our entire introduction, and I don't want this to happen again because I wanted to introduce Christopher actually. So I'm here today with Christopher, Christopher Sandbach. He's a historian, so he's kind of like supplementing all my book knowledge here with some more book knowledge of his. Christopher Sandbach wanted to make everybody aware that even though Christopher Sandbach wants to be called Christopher Sandbach on air, Christopher Sandbach is not actually the name of Christopher Sandbach. So I wanted to just announce that his real name is Thomas F.C. Waterhouse. He lives in Sussex Street in Fort Worth, Texas. The postal code is 76108. It's, of course, in the United States, and the coordinates are 32.7749 northern and 97 0.4637 46237 degrees west. I hope that clears this up. And with that, I think we can start into the episode on the development of Prussian Protestantism.
The only complaint is that most people in Texas may not. A lot of people in Texas may not consider Texas to be part of the United States. It is. It's.
True.
Despite being in the United States for over almost 200 years at this point, some of the locals have never really come to terms with it.
True. Okay, but enough of that. Let's go into Prussian Protestantism. So this episode will be a bit different. The last episodes have kind of been a chronological telling of what happens under the various monarchs. This is going back to all the way to the beginning. And we're looking at the development from Johann Sigismund, from his conversion to Calvinism, all the way to Friedrich Wilhelm I. And then the next episode will also be very likely a look back, also all the way to the era of Friedrich Wilhelm I, and all of that will be kind of the build-up to then one of the most well-known figures in Prussian history. He, of course, also adorns my title card, and that, of course, is Frederick II, also better known as Frederick the Great. So this is just going to be about how faith played into Prussia, and of course, it's a very big topic. So Afish in chat says, wait, I thought the Prussians were Lutheran, and that is exactly the first thing that we can get to, and that is Prussia is marked by a fight between Calvinism and Lutheranism. So the map you see on the right-hand side is from the 16th century, so it's actually a bit before the time frame we're starting, or just at the beginning of the time frame we're starting, and then kind of going out of that. And what you're seeing here is Brandenburg, Prussia, is Calvinist, right? And you see the Roman Catholics, the Church of England, the Lutherans, and the Huguenots in France. But yeah, the Brandenburg Prussia is Calvinist, but the people who run Brandenburg Prussia, the Hohenzollern dynasty, actually convert to Brandenburg Prussia is Lutheran, and the people who run Brandenburg Prussia, the Hohenzollers, actually convert to Calvinism. And Johann Sigismund actually still believed in a sort of second Reformation. So he thought, oh, Calvinism is so obviously intellectually superior to Lutheranism that once I convert to Calvinism, just like last time when we were converted to Lutheranism, all my people will convert with me. And he has this idea of a top-down implementation of it. Just doesn't work. It mostly conjures resentments and harsh reaction from the people. And this kind of plays into the center and periphery conflict of absolutism, especially in the developments after him, as we get into figures like Friedrich Wilhelm the Great Elector and, of course, Friedrich Wilhelm I. All of these increasingly absolutist monarchs will see the typical kind of interplay of absolutism, where the center of power kind of fights against the periphery. And in the case of Brandenburg Prussia, this really has like a confessional connotation. So the center is all Calvinist by the generation of, I think, Friedrich Wilhelm the Great Elector. Every single member of the Hohenzollern family, of the inner Hohenzollern family, are Calvinists, and then most of the high officials are also Calvinists, and then everybody else in the country is basically Lutheran. And this suppression under Johann Sigismund kind of doesn't really get anywhere, so it gives way to a discriminatory form of tolerance and a call to dialogue, and this is really where we get to Friedrich Wilhelm the Great Elector. And Friedrich Wilhelm the Great Elector, again, is kind of like a proto-modern figure, or like a very early modern figure, because in confessional things, he preaches tolerance. He has these, they even call it that way, like the tolerance edicts. They're not called that way, of course, but the word tolerance is already in the name, where he forbids the two confessions, the Calvinists and the Lutherans, to kind of go at each other during their mass. This is called the, I think, like, I don't even know what the, Chris, what's the thing called where the priest speaks from?
Pulpit? Is that or
pulpit?
The lectern? There's a couple of different possible ways, but
I think it's the pulpit.
Yeah, you see it especially in Calvinist churches.
In
That if you're
German,
if you're
for the German viewers, in German it's Kanzel, and I don't know the English word, but I think it's pulpit.
yeah
And in German it's the Kanzelpolitik, and in German, in English would be like pulpit politics, or like
yeah
pulpit, like scream, something like that. Insults. Basically, the churches, of course, on Sundays kind of rail against the other side. The Calvinists say how the Lutherans are secretly Catholic. The Lutherans say how the Calvinists are insane. Um, the issue of the conflict is the following, and that is the Calvinists basically believe the Lutherans to be proto-Catholics. The Calvinists believe that if the Reformation isn't seen through, if the confessional achievements that have been begotten in the early years of the Reformation aren't kind of pulled through all the way, then the Reformation will fail and will collapse back into Catholicism. Whilst the Lutherans are mainly motivated by their own aesthetic, their liturgical and ceremonial culture, and they don't want to give it up just because some like Calvinists are saying, well, we have to be the revolution against the Pope, and everything that reminds us of Catholicism is basically has to go away. Then, of course, considering this whole thing from a Catholic perspective, and explaining what is going to happen later, I want to mention that Catholicism, one of the reasons Catholicism is so adamant about having a pope, is that in Catholic kind of teaching, or in Catholic, I guess you would call it like social philosophy or organizational philosophy, it is understood that by organizing the bishops amongst one of their own, who is kind of like a binding element for all the bishops, the church is permitted to develop doctrine in a way that makes doctrine kind of like always able to be interpreted by the time that it exists in, so it doesn't have to basically be the same. There, of course, is the canon, and we of course basically teaching the same thing, but it expresses itself differently in different time. And we also develop upon that. We have theological developments. The understanding of the gospel gets deeper and deeper and deeper. And in order to do that, we say we need the Roman pontiff as kind of the center element to kind of keep sides balanced, to keep everybody together, because what we see in all the other denominations is basically that either people are able to advance the doctrine, but then they splinter into several groups, what we see in Protestantism, or they are just unwilling to advance their doctrine, and which is what we see in basically in Eastern Orthodoxy. So this is going to be important in regards of looking at what is going to be happening to Lutheranism in a bit, because right now in Brandenburg, Lutheranism is kind of the most conservative and the most, let's say, like Catholic that Lutheranism gets in Europe at the time. They're basically Catholics without a pope, and like with some minor differences. So, for example, in the fights between the Calvinists, the Lutherans also very much hold to the teachings of transubstantiation, which are by the other side called kind of like a popish overhang, and have to be removed, otherwise you collapse back into papism, and so on and so forth. And in the fate of the Lutherans, which will be the main focus of this video, you will see kind of how basically Catholicism without a pope plays out. Then maybe one group that also will become increasingly important during this time period, especially at the end of it and in the episodes coming after, is the Jews. It is Friedrich Wilhelm the Great Elector who takes in Jews, who takes in prominent Jews, and he also becomes something of a patron of the Jews. So when Jews are getting expelled in areas around him, he invites the richest families, he lets them settle in Brandenburg, Prussia, and he gives them certain patronages against the aggravated populace or other elites, so that the Jews may, let's say, settle and live in Brandenburg, Prussia. And then something that might also be interested in kind of like how modern and how contemporary all of this really feels is that Friedrich Wilhelm the Great Elector basically does like he's a Calvinist, and it's not that he's, even though he preaches tolerance, that doesn't mean that he isn't a Calvinist, and that he hopes that kind of from tolerance, the other side will basically see that his side is completely correct. And what he also does, of course, is he takes in a lot of immigrants, and he takes in Calvinist immigrants to kind of like supplement the population that doesn't want to convert. So you really kind of see him play the center versus periphery game in ways that are not uncommon to us today. So trying to preach a general notion of tolerance, even though he's kind of has his very own idea of how things are supposed to go, and even though he kind of like stacks the elites of the country in a certain way, kind of trying to get into ecumenical dialogue, also, which is kind of like a bit shady, and the Lutherans see it as an attempt to kind of like subvert them, getting immigrants into the country, and kind of trying to change his population that way. Those are the kind of like things he's doing. Okay, but I think that's everything I have on the Calvinist Lutheran issues up until this point. Do you have anything to say here, Christopher?
Oh well, a couple of things that I would point out is because this is their history is sort of interesting in how it tends to expand and collapse into like discrete chunks that you can, there will be whole centuries where you basically sum up what happens in one or two sentences, like the 8th century. Not a lot going on. There was a battle in England, and there's the Merovingians are ruling in France. I actually don't know if that's who it was, but the Reformation is one of these instances where all of a sudden you go from centuries being your unit of measurement to like at times there's like specific months are gonna matter, and a lot of times the Calvinist and the really the Second Reformation is kind of what you would have to call it. But it's also worth pointing out that the people who were living through this time oftentimes didn't think of the Reformation that has just occurred in like sort of world historical terms. Um, there to them, it's just this is the way things are progressing on the ground on a daily basis, and so you will start to see as this whole period pulls apart, you will find reformers who are like, okay, well, we've gone far enough, and then of course there will be ones that say, no, we have to continue going, and this sort of thing. And this really plays quite a bit into the politics of who ends up becoming more sympathetic to either, and I would group Anglicans and Lutherans together, and also the Calvinists and the Scottish Presbyterians together in like sort of two sort of loose groups. And the way you sort of conceive yourself and your position in society is going to have a lot more to do with which direction you gravitate towards in terms of religion than it probably ever has in the past, especially since there's Catholicism was remarkably diverse prior to prior to the 12th century. But when you're looking at the difference between Lutherans and I mean, you can look at this map and you can see who becomes where Calvinism becomes very popular, and you can sort of intuit the kind of people who are becoming becoming Calvinist rather than sticking with a Lutheran, which is essentially it's all. I don't know just a whole lot about Lutheranism, but I mean it's a confessional faith, and it maintains a lot of the strictures. There's a remarkable amount of Catholicism left in Lutheranism, except for like some of the political structures in this, or the hierarchical structures change somewhat. But when you're looking at Calvinists, you are actually looking at something that is considerably more revolutionary, and it also appeals to a generally different group of people. So Calvinism emerges. A guy I used to do a lot of shows with once referred to Calvin as a lawyer for God, and that's That's a pretty good example, pretty good estimation of the kind of thinking that goes into becoming Calvinist, or the idea to to run a country like Calvinist. So you're looking frequently at university educated persons, frequently people who are like lifelong scholars, and also ruling class individuals. So it's a very popular in France, for instance. Like, one of the reasons the wars of religion in France, or the Saint Bartholomew's Day massacre, ends up being so nasty is because in France, a lot of the people who were converting to Catholicism were members of the petty nobility and the petty gentry, and so, like, while while Calvinist numbers tend to be relatively small outside of Scotland and the Netherlands and like Geneva, um, they tend to be figures that are able to wield a considerable amount of influence in the world, and it ends up being a religious persuasion that's considerably more politically oriented. So this is like, Calvinism is a political revolution in addition to being a religious reformation, whereas Lutheranism is a little bit more mild. It doesn't quite have like the like we're going to abolish, and this is one thing that Calvinists frequently do, that they're going to abolish the the medieval system of physics, and they're going to overturn Aristotelian logic and replace it with their own homegrown system. So I mean, that's the kind of like world wrecking discontinuities with the past that Calvinists are creating, that Lutherans aren't necessarily. Lutherans are going to be really a little bit more conservative, um, and that's one good way to one way to think about the difference between these two groups as as everything progresses.
Yeah, I mean, harkening back to the last episode, so like the last episode specifically, the kind of the upset between father and son every generation for the Hohenzollerns. It's something very, very Calvinist. It's how they just exist in a sort of like constant revolution, and they're not bad revolutionaries in the sense that they are very intelligent and that they're therefore able to kind of lawyer themselves out of the past and into a future that is usually more convenient to the times. So yeah. Um, Let us then continue and let us see what happens to the Lutherans, because the Calvinist situations will basically remain the same. So they're kind of always the power center of Prussia. They're always favored at the universities, even though the universities aren't exclusively Calvinist. Um, and in the kind of like more, um, but I think we'll get to that in pietism, because yeah, we'll get to that. So what happens in Europe at the time is emerging out of Lutheranism is the movement of pietism. And the first very important figure here is Philipp Jakob Spener, who lived from 1635 to 1705, and he becomes a major character of the major critic of the brittle character that Lutheranism had taken at the time of his life. So basically, what happened is that Lutheranism really became obsessed with kind of keeping the right canon, keeping the right doctrine, and in that sense became more and more what in Germany we call abgehoben, which I think would translate to English as kind of like levitating or taken off into the sky. So basically, what it means is that Lutheranism more and more became a thing that took part within the circles of Lutheran theologians, and the pastoral needs of the populace were kind of being neglected. Um, and again, just kind of showing this from a Catholic perspective, this is exactly what we would kind of expect. So Lutheranism has to ground in or zero in on its own orthodoxy, otherwise it kind of shatters. But then this orthodoxy becomes something that becomes kind of stale and brittle, something that isn't able to develop, something that isn't able to grow, because the thing it would need to grow, it would need to be able to kind of have an disagreement within itself that has an arbiter. So, for example, right now in Catholicism, you see like multiple streams that are potentially conflicting. So, for example, North America, you see like a real development into kind of like a cultural conservatism, into an almost fetishism for older Catholic culture, a very like more traditional minded idea of Catholicism, and there are of course kind of theological ideas and theological strains that go with that. And then in South America, you see something that goes way more into something you might call a progressive or a non-traditional minded view on Catholicism, which really looks at the indigenous kind of religions and tries to see how what we in Catholicism kind of call the rays of light in that religion, kind of see, okay, what can we take from them? What do we have to leave because it is demonic? It even borders into something like syncretic tendencies. And both of these, let's say,
that.
if they're left,
Wait,
huh?
what do we have to leave because it's demonic? That's an interesting way of putting that. It's kind of
I mean,
funny.
yeah, it's something that happens more frequently than people think. I mean, when
Right.
Christianity took over Rome, it was basically, yeah, okay, what can we take from the Roman culture, and what do we have to leave because it's demonic? It's like, yeah, that's pretty much what you do. um, so these two streams can basically kind of grow up very different vectors of theology, so very different directions of theology, and to kind of get them back under one cape into one church, you need this kind of arbitering function that the Pope provides, where he's like the superior, and he says, okay, um, how can we allow you guys to go as far as you can? How can we allow you guys to go as far as you can? And kind of allow this exchange and this flourishing. And this is something that Lutheranism cannot do. It kind of has to really maintain and hone in and focus in on this one interpretation that it keeps common amongst all its churches, and with that, it becomes unappealing to the people. So Philipp Jakob Spener has an easy solution to this, and that is that, well, if the people don't like, let the people participate more. And what he comes up with are the so-called Collegia Pietas, and these are basically home Bible study groups. So in Germany, they're called Heimkreise, which literally just translates into home circles, and they are basically dedicated to what is called pious discussion. So the idea is you sit down with like your friends and your family, and then you talk about the Bible once or twice a week, and then that way your faith and your faith experience is really trying to grow, or it's really growing. And it was something, the Pietist movement was really focused around experience of the faith, and kind of like something that's very visceral, very, very close to the body. Immediately, huh?
Here's an instance where someone has possibly encountered pietism without really understanding. Well, of course, actually, a lot of Sunday schools in America for American audiences are. But I was reading something, and I was struck by an instance of the practice of pietism that that you just described exceptionally well, and this is in the person of Johann Sebastian Bach, who frequently, I mean, he's one of the more, especially music scholars, really like to tug and pull on him because they're always seeking some sort of enlightened humanist, secular humanist figure in him, and then they're constantly stymied by the fact that other than his musical output, there's relatively little to go on, to cover Bach's life. But one of the things that is extant from Bach's life is there are his personal copy of the Bible that he would force, that they'll put it as that he was forcing his family to sit around and listen to him read the Bible. But this is in part, this is where the tradition of the family Bible and stuff comes from. So like Bach was very famous for having forced or invited his family to sit around 2 or 3 nights a week sometimes and intensely read the Bible and discuss it. There are even instances where he's going into his Bible and he's comparing 2 separate editions of it, 2 separate translations of it, and And this is another intensely sort of pietist sort of thing to do, because when there's a discrepancy between two translations, he picks the one he wants and corrects the other. Okay, that's a that's a good example of the kind of, of, well, really, of the kind of drift away from what you would call a referential standard in theology that this sort of thing also starts to create. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah. Do you know what religion Bach's son converted to?
Oh, probably Roman Catholicism, because he was in the right part of the country.
Oh yeah, baby.
Yeah.
There actually are, I think, with Bach Junior, he publishes some pieces that were um, for the Roman Catholic Church, I think for Roman Catholic liturgy. And the interesting thing is they don't sound like any of his other pieces, and it's very likely that kind of the father published those under the son's name because he could never publish something for the Roman Church. So might be some Johann Wolfgang Bach somewhere in the Roman Catholic Church. Who knows? Yeah, going on to pietism. So it immediately has like very high popular appeal, and you can really think about it kind of like 60s counterculture. It is a counterculture to Lutheranism. It has it isn't supposed to have a high distrust of church authority, but in effect it has. And of course, the church authority in turn also vehemently opposes it because it kind of undermines the idea of a priest in and of itself. But then, of course, why it kind of is able to grow in Lutheranism is because, well, Luther called for the priesthood of the pious, right? So there was the idea of, okay, everybody can be a priest, and this is really the fulfillment of that. This is really the final step. Nevertheless, Philipp Jakob Spener is driven out of Saxony in 1691, and you can guess 3 times which country takes him in and gives him patronage.
It's Prussia.
Prussia. He becomes a Propst in. Yeah,
of course it is.
Yeah, just try to make this more participatory. He becomes Propst in Berlin, and there he kind of has the backing of Johann. Oh, is it? I think it's the. Oh no, Friedrich Wilhelm the Great Elector would be Friedrich Wilhelm the Great Elector. Yeah. Or is it? I'm not sure right now. I haven't got my dates all collected right now. It could also already be Friedrich Wilhelm I. It has to. Oh, okay. It's stopped that. You guys can check. It's 1691.
No,
You can
yeah,
check in
no.
5 episodes.
The Great Elector died in 1688.
Yeah, and it's his son. It's Frederick the First. Yes. And then it will be Frederick. Very soon will be Friedrich Wilhelm I. That's who I was thinking of. And Friedrich Wilhelm I will be the main character in the rise of Pietism and the main patron in the rise of Pietism. But right now, Pietism is still, it's kind of fringe. The Lutheran Church doesn't like it, but the Lutheran Church also does hard in defending against it. It is very popular amongst Lutherans all over Europe, and it is very hard to fight because it's basically just people sitting down at home and talking about the Bible. So I think with that we're getting to the peak of Pietism. Or do you have anything to add to the beginning?
I would also add, though, that this is like, you refer to it as a counterculture in a lot of ways, and there is a mythology that goes along with Pietism that it persists to this day in a lot of what I would call the low church Protestant groups, which is this is an almost, and this also will eventually play into the the reintroduction frequently of ethnic Jews into Europe, is that this is in many ways the beginning of restorationist theology. And so these are people who imagine themselves as members of this kind of a weird, I've always thought this fixation was a little unusual in Christianity, is to always try, and especially amongst Protestants, and the Orthodox do this a lot too. The Catholics, I think, are the best about not doing this, where they'll get in an argument about how similar they are to the quote early church or the apostolic church or something like that. And so they're very consciously modeling these things on what they perceive as being the first century, the first century house churches. And
Uh-huh.
they're not necessarily wrong in principle or anything like that. But when it comes to we're pushing back against this from an institutionalized faith perspective, it's actually very difficult to be a Christian church, to be a self-admitted Christian church who then appears to be waging war on what the early on on an attempt to return to the first principles of Christianity. And that's why institutionalized churches tend to lose this battle a lot, because the optics of it are miserable, and it's a counterculture that tends to be able to feed itself in a lot of ways. So when you think, oh, why didn't they just clamp down on it? It's not that easy.
I
You
mean,
know.
I mean, trying to kind of connect again to the 60s, you can also think about, well, the hippies, right? Like the way the hippies kind of communicated themselves to the world, in the way, of course, like media and everybody kind of also um, showed hippies was as these like, oh, we couldn't hurt a fly. We're kind of like, okay, maybe we're bad at our work, whatever. We're just kind of trying to be good people. Sorry, we're trying to live down to earth. We're trying to, like, we're really trying to do what it says in the Bible, and we're kind of like spiritual, and we're very heartfelt. And that is, of course, how the hippies are seen, and again, kind of the idea of, well, just kicking their faces in is very bad
Yeah,
optics,
yeah.
because what
Shooting altruism in the face does not look good ever.
yeah. And of course, I mean, we can, I guess we would like stray away too much if we talked about how hippies really were, but of course it wasn't true. Let's just leave it at that. But yeah, also considering Jews, this is something that also plays into the peak of pietism. But I think I'll just mention it in a bit. So the most important person for the peak of pietism is Spener's student August Hermann Franke, who lives from 1663 to 1727, and he becomes a favorite of Friedrich Wilhelm I, so the second king of Prussia. And the reason for that is they both have a certain, and this is also something that's very endemic and appears all the time in history and even just like everyday society. They share a view of religion as a very fragile thing. So, not the truth is like a lion, set him free and it will defend itself. They basically just say, well, our religion has to be safeguarded at every point. And both of them kind of get this idea that they really have to work to implement it. They have to work to safeguard it. They have to work to keep it. So what Friedrich Wilhelm I does is he puts all of that work, of course, into his army ambitions that we talked about in the last episode. And August Hermann Franke, or just Franke, puts all of that work into public institutions. So what happens is Franke is sent to Halle, which is in the western part of Prussia. Kind of, if you remember the older episodes, they have these lands like somewhere in like the North Rhine-Westphalian regions that are very disconnected from the country, even at this point. Halle is in there, and it becomes the center of the Pietist movement. And this second generation of Pietism, it has like leading theologians. It is appealing to the elites of, especially the Calvinist elites in Prussia and also other elites around Europe. So it's really able to present itself well. And it has like various causes that it kind of channels its energy into. So pietism before that has been very you can like very eager to convert people and had kind of like grown a reputation for that. You can liken that to today's Jehovah's Witnesses, who like knock on your door and then they tell you, oh, do you want to talk about God? And then you immediately like, I don't want to talk to you. And then you hopefully politely tell them off. And of course, what kind of swings over from these people is a certain over-eagerness that is very uncomfortable. And this is also something that is said about the pietists at the time. So I'm hoping, I'm kind of starting to create a picture here that I think is the most accurate of them, is they're really kind of like what we see in America today, these kind of like reborn Christian types, I don't know, YouTube channel Living Waters kind of people. And in the second generation, they become more sophisticated and they channel all that energy, all that, what in the end is most likely just insecurity, into just a lot of social works. They take in a lot of donations. They build a lot of social buildings. So they build schools, hospitals, orphanages, and they wage a war on poverty. So it's really like kind of like a Reaganite culture where it's like, oh, we are waging a war on these various evils in the world, and their big cause is poverty. They implement kind of a bureau that is dedicated to getting rid of poverty. They have these work initiatives that people can get work in. They have schools that train people in various things. So again, it's very modern. And something I also want to point out to, something that also is at this day very much part of scholarship, and I think is very important to understanding this time and to understanding the rise of modernism, is that it is now very much, let's say, settled in the literature that if the state grows out and takes over familiar obligation, it crowds out the family. So everything you do with social institution will be at the cost of the family culture in your country. And then when you consider back, or like think back to last episode, kind of where we talked about how Friedrich Wilhelm I broke up the aristocratic families to reshape the aristocracy from a collection of families into like one basically big family under the king, and his like taking everybody's children in order to take everybody's children. We have something very similar on the societal scale at large. So everybody is kind of removed from their family and put into this one unity of the Prussian state. Everybody becomes kind of like a dependent on the state, or kind of a family member of the state almost. And that is basically what pietism kind of gets into. It's very much a complementary force to absolutism, which is also interesting because it kind of starts slightly before many of the absolutist reforms, so it kind of even almost precedes it in many ways. And it also has this effect of homogenizing, of absolutizing the population to just one big mass.
You know,
Um,
we were
yeah.
talking about absolutism a night or two ago in a chat, and again, because I'm always going on about this, but people sort of frequently they misinterpret absolutism, and of course I may be misinterpreting it a little bit too, because I lean really hard. I lean really hard in the direction, in the belief that this was the historical trajectory, which you essentially just laid out.
Mm-hmm.
That absolutism is functionally a Protestant political theory. I mean, it almost doesn't, it almost can't exist without these sort of Protestant innovations that are coming. So like when you're talking about somebody like August Hermann Franke, he's a very emblematic figure of the sort of rising interest in ideas that would become absolutism, and he's very interested in the development of a quote Christian political economy. I actually don't know that political economy is a phrase that would have been in use yet, but these are sort of the very early rising tendrils of it, if not. And some things that he sort of did that he's responsible for a lot of stuff that we associate today with again like low church societies like the Gideons or something like that. He has an important part to play in founding the first press that produces Bibles that are cheap enough that the average person could have their whole copy of the Bible, instead of like have a few pages that have been torn out of a folio copy or that have been nailed to the wall. So there is some time lag between the invention of the printing press and dissemination of relatively cheap literature, and he's one of the innovators in this area. He's got, and by the time he dies, he's got a network of schools that are teaching poor children, and he's teaching 23. He's teaching 20 around between 23 and 2,500 students. In his personal, in I had a professor that famously wrote that. Well, I don't want to give away how famous she was, but she wrote a book about how um, about interpretations, or self interpretations through the classical cultures that these different early modern European states had. And one thing that sort of like puts people off whenever she initially explains the idea of it is she makes the claim that English people and German people, and especially German people, and I can attest to this, through in my own historical research, just from the number of the amount of German language scholarship there is on the Byzantine Empire, and there's almost none in English. But that German and English people tended, and it dates to about this time, they tended to sort of start. They tended to interpret themselves as the inheritors of Greek culture. And like you were talking about last week, how is Protestantism and the rise of democracy, how are these intrinsically entwined with one another? Well, there it is. And this is you start seeing this romanticizing of Greek culture, Greek political terms, Greek, return specifically to Greek in translations of the Bible. And the state, especially Prussia, it starts to sort of model itself after what it perceives, maybe not necessarily what actually was, the Spartan state. And so, like, this is this is where a lot of these state functions that have been maybe not maybe not neglected, but just not specifically emphasized by previous regimes. And so they also enter a really target-rich environment, and they're very successful very quickly because of the wars that have devastated this part of Europe in recent decades. So whenever they go out and they start finding their little ragged schools or whatever, they become very popular very quickly. Another one of the things that's hard to, that's hard to sort of, from the modern perspective, tease out, is that we tend to want to think of these people, of Protestants, or Lutherans, Protestants, Catholics, as kind of being like oil and water, as though they were always at one another's throat. But this isn't strictly the case. Franke, for instance, was very popular. He's it's kind of hard to imagine this sort of thing today, but he's a Protestant preacher he's very popular with Roman Catholics. Like they'll frequently come to his sermons, and so he's saying and doing things that people at the time considered compelling, even if they are historically disastrous.
Yeah, I mean, he really is the height of pietism here, right? Like, he's a great theologian. He takes Europe by storm, basically. But before we get further into him, Afish asks, and I think it's a pretty good question. I'd agree with the guest, Afish. First, Chris is not a guest; he's now the co-host of this show. Until further notice. But what does Chris then think of the Russian absolutism then? Chris, what do you then think of the Russian absolutism then?
Oh, I think last night, actually, well, it was a couple of nights ago when we were talking about that, and I actually said, oh, the Russians never really cottoned on to absolutism, actually. Peter the Great is the guy who brings absolutism to, and of course he's German, he's really trying to Germanize he's trying to Germanize the Russians. And after he dies, they have some whispers, some of the elements of what becomes absolutism remain there, but really, I mean, it quickly turns syncretic with the Russian the Russian historical political tradition, re-percolates into the Russian monarchy, and it becomes something that it's very difficult to talk about. It's very difficult to talk about both Charles II of England, Frederick the Great of Prussia, the Sun King in France, and these Russian monarchs as all being absolutism, as though this is like really the same thing. So it's kind of an unwieldy word to apply to the Russians, I think. Although there are some, they did sort of it was sort of pushed on them at one point. But I'm not sure you could really call like Elizabeth in Russia. I'm not sure she's really absolutist. That she might just be a brutal, murderous woman. You know, that's the.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Elizabeth was quite the character. Afish asks, so it was basically an import that dissolved over time? Question mark.
Oh wait, where is that? Oh, I can read these somewhere, can't I?
Yes.
It's way back up there. Oh wait, no, just repeat it to me again so I can
So it was
listen.
basically an import that dissolved over time?
Yeah,
Question mark.
yeah. And then maybe the the Russians start to really liberalize hard in the 19th century, but that's they like sort of pick up on Western political developments a little bit later. But I think they go native again for a while after Peter. That's just me shooting
Okay.
from the hip too. I'm not just real well read in Russian history. That's kind of one of my dark areas of the map.
Okay. Somebody says in chat, absolutism limited by coup d'etat. Maybe I just leave it at that and we continue with the presentation. So, yeah, as I said, Franke, he's kind of like the pietist guy. I think one of the ways that it's kind of like more or less described in the book is that sacramentality is moving out of the church and into the workplace. And this is really what happens here in Pietism. And this is also why Pietism is so. So the book calls the chapter on Pietism the third way between Lutheranism and Calvinism. It's not really. And we will see in the decline of Pietism why. It's still very much Calvinist, but it is very much Lutheran. But it does exhibit also kind of a Calvinist sympathy and a certain Calvinist overlap.
Yeah,
And
that's a sort of strange characterization because to my mind, pietism is like the most Protestant thing. It's like if you turn Protestant up to like 15 out of 10, pietism is what you get.
yeah, but again, it's kind of like it plays the other side, where like Lutheranism at the time was kind of unable to really develop its doctrine. Pietism is just development and nothing else. It's just like live the Bible right here, right now, take it. And so with him and what you say, he kind of like blinds the population at the time because it doesn't really get clear that he really takes sacramentality out of the church. It's more like he takes sacramentality like everywhere, like he spreads it around, like you spread butter on a toast, right? Um, and so everybody, of course, it's kind of in love with him. He also builds this through the pietist sympathies everywhere else, and because Halle really becomes the center of pietism, they also start setting up this pietist network all throughout Europe. Through it, they will also start selling medicine, books, pamphlets, and kind of sermons. And these also, amongst other things, of course, besides the profits they gain from just the sale of those things, these also serve, especially the sermons, as kind of like calls to donate money to Halle, where there will be more buildings built, and everybody's kind of seeing, well, what's coming out of Halle this time? What are they doing? This is so great. Look at all the hospitals. Look at how they care for the poor. Look at how they care for the young. There really was a feeling that they were building in Halle kind of like a heaven on earth. And kind of like a city on God on earth. And if you kind of contrast that with Catholicism again, of course, the Catholic Church says, well, the church already is kind of like the kingdom of heaven on earth. I personally like to call it like the embassy of the kingdom of heaven, right? So just like with an embassy, when you're in the German embassy, you're technically on German ground. So with a Catholic Church, you're technically on holy ground. Which is why, for example, you're not allowed to kill anybody in a Catholic Church, even if you were allowed to kill them in another setting, for example, in combat. And pietism kind of stands against it and says, well, we are building the kingdom of God right here. Why? What do you have, Catholics? Basically, it's like, it's not really that polemic against Catholicism. It's a very non-polemic movement at its peak. Most polemics are really just kind of against the Lutheran kind of parts that are pushing back against it. But yeah, it really kind of like presents itself as this perfection of Christianity. And of course, why I also think pietism is important for us today is because while we have a lot of institutions of Christian heritage that kind of, I mean, we're talking about NGOs in Germany, we're talking about institutions like Caritas. All of these used to be Christian, the Red Cross, so on and so forth. And they have this idea of, well, we're doing everything that Christianity demands. Kind of, we're the fulfillment of the Christian promise. And therefore, we don't really need to believe. We don't really need all that like sacramentality and like church canon law kind of stuff. We just do what Christianity is all about with charitable institutions. And one of the first, let's say, callings of that is really in this pietist movement, which has removed itself from its church. It's kind of like has a very shaky connections with the Lutheran Church, but it really sees itself as kind of like this superior and best way of enacting Christianity and the future for Christianity henceforth. Anything to add?
No, that was good, I think.
Yeah.
And to translate it for American, what you are familiar with is the social gospel. This is the beginning of it.
Basically. Something I mentioned in the beginning, Jews. So the Pietists are the first movement that really tries to convert Jews in like a meaningful way. This is because Spener had a vision, or like I think it wasn't even a vision, it was like a theological, it was like an eschatological opinion that there soon would be a mass conversion of the Jews to Christianity. So the Pietists tried to mass convert the Jews, basically. How effective do you think it was?
The problem with this sort of thing is that frequently the Jews would say, "Okay, yeah, we're converted," and then they would just go back to doing what they were doing.
That's true. That didn't happen in this case because the rich Jews were protected.
Right.
So that they could be Jews. They weren't pressured into Judaism this time. They were just the Pietists. They learned Hebrew. They learned Yiddish, and they tried to lawyer the Jews into Christianity, basically.
This never works. It results in Judaizing. It always ends up going the other way.
It goes the other way. But what does happen, fair enough to them, is at the time, it's the early modern period. This is one of the times where there's Jewish upswing in civilization. And of course, when you talk about the history of the Jews, they always say, well, the reason we go up in society is because we work so hard and stuff like that. And what they forget to mention is that usually it's more of a dissolving of the crops. Basically, there were a bunch of dirt poor Jews running around, completely like basically fated to die because, well, what was really happening was that the thumbscrews on the Jewish population were increasing in the early modern period. So either you were like a very clever Jew who kind of made it through that, who was able to apply himself and to give a benefit that could mean that he could stay around or had some other means of staying around. These are the people who become the rich Jews and the influential Jews in the future, or you just, well, you become the beggar and you die. That's how it goes.
You end up migrating east into the Pale of Settlement, and that's where that's where you stay.
Yeah, that's true. And the begging Jews, and especially begging Jews who are kind of traveling through Brandenburg into the east, because Brandenburg was one of the better routes to the east. They managed to convert those because basically these are people out on their luck. They don't have anything anymore. And so, of course, those are people who are, as always, very easy to convert. So they at least have some success, although it's not really a success in their conversion methods and more that they're just a lot of very poor Jews running around at the time. Okay, and then it all goes down. So pietism basically exists with Friedrich Wilhelm I. Frederick II will not take over the patronage of his father. He calls the Pietists the Lutheran Jesuits, and if you've ever known of a person at the time, then Jesuit is basically the worst thing you can call a person. There is one thing that still gets pushed through, and this is pretty important for German history itself, and that is that Pietist school reforms are carrying on, especially in the person of Johann Hecker, pictured on the right, and he is the inventor of the German Realschule. He also creates an Armutsschule, which is kind of for the very poor strata. The Realschule is for kind of what you would consider the middle class. So we have Realschule in Germany today. I think you don't know this, Christopher. The Germany has a 3-tier school system. It goes Gymnasium. If you graduate there, you're allowed into university. Realschule, which is kind of like the at this point like lower middle class jobs. So when you graduate from Realschule, you can usually kind of go into a trade or something. And then Hauptschule, which is kind of basically the school for people who are fated to do blue collar work. And this starts with Johann Hecker, and he gets this idea of kind of like tiering the school system and getting the more brighter kids into one school and the less bright kids into other school, and it works out better that way, basically. And Halle, the shining beacon of pietism, without the patronage of Friedrich Wilhelm I, kind of evolves. You could also say devolves, or just proceeds into what I would say is just the logical next step, and that is rationalism. And yeah, one of the problems the third generation has, so this is after Franke is dead at this point, is that it also just didn't produce any good theologians. So you could say, well, it was dying and therefore no good theologians came of it. Or you could say, oh, it didn't have any good theologians, so it wasn't able to appeal to anyone anymore, and therefore it died. Kind of both sides probably go hand in hand with one another. But basically, with Friedrich Wilhelm I's death, the chapter on pietism immediately closes again.
It's sort of interesting to point this out, because this is about, like I said, Pietism was very influential in the development of especially New England literature. So, like, the reason a lot of this stuff sounds so familiar to American audiences is because, like, the Puritans, like Cotton Mather and Increase Mather, and they're very smitten with German pietism, and a lot of it gets imported directly into sort of the Puritan political economy of early New England, and it similarly collapses around the same time. So it's not just like not a thing that maybe is just happening in Germany. This movement sort of gets snuffed out like sort of worldwide. In New England, they had the incident called the halfway covenant, and then after that, from then on out, what the Puritans were is never the same as what it was before.
Okay. One of the things that are worth mentioning that I've kind of left out so far is pietism will carry on a bit also in the military. Under Friedrich Wilhelm I, he kind of puts a lot of pietists into the military. I think it also just bears pointing out, because I think I neglected it so far, that pietists were really seen by the Hohenzollerns as kind of a fifth column into Lutheranism that they controlled. So he put a lot of pietists, Friedrich Wilhelm I put a lot of pietists into his so beloved military in order to basically, because his military, all of his soldiers were basically Lutherans, because again, Lutheran population. The pietists were there to kind of like be the more Calvinist friendly priests, and I don't even know what army priests are called, but they're basically like army priests. And through that also pietism, of course, spread under Friedrich Wilhelm I into other parts of Prussia. And this will survive actually onto Frederick the Great, where there will still be a lot of pietist army priests, or whatever you call them, in the Prussian military, which at this point have kind of like gotten used to Prussian military culture, which just like Friedrich Wilhelm I was kind of very rough, very girdy, very kind of like they dance a lot, they wear powdered wigs, they're rough with one another, very fraternal, basically.
Yeah, the word you were looking for is chaplain.
Military chaplain, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, and with that, we already get on to the last bit for this episode, and then we might look at some comments and discussion like that. So foreign policy or Protestant influence on foreign policy. Foreign policy is mostly dominated by geopolitical, not confessional considerations. We could actually, there could actually be a case to be made that any civilization that puts its own ideological concerns above its geopolitical concerns is fated to die soon, and Prussia isn't one of those. But there still is an understanding of kind of we are a Protestant nation and we are aiding the international Protestant movement. So they take in.
I think geopolitics itself the idea of geopolitics is itself almost an outgrowth of the concept of national interest, which is really pretty dependent on the rise of Protestantism and absolutism. So I mean, this is one aspect where even the Catholic Counter-Reformation does end up absorbing some of these ideas that have come about in the Reformation, and like it's not entirely not there, but the idea of like a an entity with the nation state, it's a little Protestant. So there's in some ways you can almost read this less emphasis on the confessional confessional considerations that's how saturated the world has become with some of these Protestant concepts. Political economy now. These are things that are it's hard to imagine these happening without the rise of Protestantism. Sorry,
okay,
that was a little
multiple qualifications. So what you say is true. Afish also says in chat, which is also true, he says he disagree and say it's an element of political reality that political actors have to deal with in every decision. Both of that is true. So let me qualify a bit. So what I meant by kind of like geopolitical reality is more like political reality outside of the own country, or just political reality at large. The problem is there's no real word for that, because if you kind of like talk about political reality, then you get into like realpolitik, and that is its own kind of like meaning. But what I want to point out is kind of like the way just the die are cast in like the situation you find yourself in, right? Like for example, in the 30 Years' War, people join on both sides of the technically confessional war. Protestants join the quote-unquote Catholic side, Catholic join the quote-unquote Protestant side, and the reason of that is just kind of like an astute managing of like your own interests.
Oh, okay.
At this point, national interests haven't really developed, but there's a kind of like front loading of that, and then certain accepting that you can't just insist on your own ideological basis and say, oh, everything has to be going according to my ideology, and we'll just believe in that and we'll just push ahead like that. So if Prussia was like that, it would have basically declared itself as that, as which it understood itself, which is kind of like the heartland and the protector of the Protestant Reformation, and it would have basically declared hostile relations to all non-Protestant countries. And instead, they kind of like take Protestant interests back in favor of immediate political interests, and try to on the low hand, on the side, kind of strengthen the Protestant cause. They do this a lot by resettling a lot of Protestants into their lands and kind of trying to gain strength that way. There's a case of a resettling of Salzburg refugees that kind of becomes a propaganda coup. So they really like propagandize that everywhere for various reasons, because they basically open up new land where they can expand basically or develop land that they've already had. It's because the Salzburg refugees are actually Lutherans, so it's kind of like we're now at kind of a twin confessional state. We really understand ourselves as that. So we take in these Lutherans, even though we're Calvinist ruler. And what also kind of happens here is that we see the build up to the eventual break with the Holy Roman Empire, where there's an indirect challenge, but not yet a direct challenge of the imperial position. Where it's basically kind of like, okay, we are the strongest nation in Protestantism. Not really true, but kind of the understanding we are the strongest nation in Protestantism, or we will be soon. And we will break away from the Holy Roman Empire, which is just like Roman Catholic, and we do the Protestant thing and further the Protestant cause. All of that is still being played under the hand, but it will emerge in the becoming independent of Prussia, and in Prussia really understanding itself against the Holy Roman Empire. Okay, and that is the presentation. So, anything you have to add, Christopher?
No, I thought that was well handled.
Oh, come on, we don't have to fill it.
I started to try and really complicate the matter by talking about like sort of a very specialist, narrow definition of geopolitics. And I was like, okay, I decided that you were actually right, but I will agree also with the comment section here and say that like in large measure what you're describing is sort of stewardship rather than
Yes.
rather than governance, and that's like I do definitely do make that distinction between stewardship and political economy. I think that's a good distinction to point out. So like I would do that, like from my perspective, political economy is Protestant and stewardship is it's more universal, but Catholics tend to emphasize that sort of thing more. As you can see it in differing versions of social justice. So like the incredibly legalistic, convoluted concepts of social justice that developed in the Protestant world versus the ones that did later on. And of course, this is way outside the time frame, but I think Catholic social justice is a good deal closer to something like stewardship.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I really hope in this episode we kind of showed how really recent, like, or how like pertaining this is to the modern situation, because a lot of that is very similar to things that played out, not that like in a very similar way, and not that recent our history. And again, I really want to point out, so kind of taking on to another project of mine. I mentioned in the last episode I'm trying to write a book, and the preliminary title is Square Society and Circle Society. And what it is about is basically something I realized during my bachelor's thesis, and that is how, depending on the state of the family, societies basically morph into two different kinds. And one is basically like a series of competing clans barely held together by a political system. So this is kind of the square society, which is very fractured into like individual families, but it's also very happy and very fertile. And then on the other end of the extreme, you have the circle society, where basically the state becomes one big family, which is what we've been getting into in the West, and which is what we have to get out of, because, and if not for the only reason, that these societies tend to be much less happy and tend to be basically infertile. So the fertility problem in the West mostly actually is a product of our misunderstanding of the importance of family culture, and also a misunderstanding of what plays into and doesn't play into family cultures. For example, the German Conservative Party, the CDU, kind of realized that the death of the family was a very bad thing for Germany in the 70s and in the 60s, I think even. And they didn't realize, however, how much the general culture of politics and the general social body they had helped construct played into that. So they just kind of tried to subsidize families and then say, okay, it's probably going to help. And well, 50 years later, 60 years later, we can say it didn't at all. And the reason for that is that state subsidies, again, are just kind of like an additional point of the state kind of taking over the kind of personage and the more intimate familiar part of the person. And this is also where a lot of kind of political divides actually break into. So a lot of people are libertarians just because the state basically tries to be a family, and you say, well, I have a good father, I have a good mother, and you're kind of like an abusive stepmom. What are you doing? And a lot of that happens here. A lot of that happens in the development of Protestantism, in the development of Lutheranism, in the unwitting birth of pietism out of the belly of Lutheranism, which kind of tries to devour the father, then dies, and then reshapes itself into rationalism and gives the ground for the German Enlightenment. Pietism will even be found in Hegel's teleology. So if you analyze Hegel's teleology and this kind of like coming to an understanding of self, that is very pietist. Something that also happens at the time. So the Rosicrucians have been around. Pietism is more like a later 16th century thing. The Rosicrucians have been around since the early 16th century. And of course, occultist and esoteric movements and groups also flourish on the setting that Pietism provides, because it's basically an unsupervised group. You sit together with your friends and family, and depending on how you guys are feeling, you can be very receptive to occultist and esoteric ideas. And all of this kind of comes together to shape the Europe that we're having today.
Are you familiar with he's a German theorist. His name's Reinhard Koska. I don't know how to pronounce his name, actually, because I used him a lot in my graduate work, and the whole time during, because you have to do the defense over and over again, and I would pronounce his name different ways, and professors would stop and laugh at me, and because they used to always. This is one of the things I never know when I'm pronouncing German words right, because my professors really like to mess with me, and they would, like, when I would pronounce it right, they would sometimes stop me and make me say it over again, and they'd tell me to say it the wrong way just to see if they could confuse me, and they'd play a joke on me or whatever. But his name is it's Reinhard. I got the first one right, and his name's Kossfelleck is his name. He wrote Critique. He wrote Critique and Crisis, and he's sort of an anti-Habermas type. Well, Jürgen Habermas is responding to him. And that's what's the way, because he came first, and he emphasizes especially the role of the bifurcation of politics and the private sphere, and he locates quite a bit of this bifurcation of this it calls it the pathogenesis of the modern state, which is that he is essentially postulating that because of this bifurcation between the private sphere and the public sphere, the private sphere becomes more and more separate from the day-to-day realities and constraints that are placed on actually governing. And he locates a lot of it in the rise of the Pietists, and in particular the Rosicrucians. It's a group that he really went after for some reason. So I was just curious if you were familiar with him.
No, I'm sorry. Afish says in chat, Russia is one of the biggest examples of that. I think he's talking about what I would call a circle society. They abort a ridiculous percentage of children and lose tremendous amounts of people to tuberculosis, alcoholism, and HIV, as well as migration. With regards to abortion percentage, I think they are the biggest in the world, if I recall correctly. Yes, and they are a great example, because communism is kind of one of the perfections of what I would call a circle society. So it takes community completely outside of the family. Communists, of course, famously hated the family all the way back, going back to Marx and Engels. One of the biggest things the communists actually fight against are the conceptions of the family. And they try to abolish it completely, because they see in it kind of like a natural oppression of man against man, a father against son, husband against wife. So because they are trying to give the communist utopia where there's no class struggle, they try to do away with the family as well. And that, of course, again, really creates and the attempts and in many parts in Russia, kind of successful attempts of sabotaging the family and its natural unity. It really creates the kind of people that are part of the circle society, because one of the reasons I wrote the book, or I'm writing the book, it's I hope I don't turn into one of those people who are just running around like, I'm writing a book, but depending on future developments, it
You know, I
might
don't know.
postpone for
I don't
quite a
know about
while.
that claim that things have gotten way worse in Russia since the dissolution of the USSR, because the USSR was
Uh,
it was a wave up state and a wave down state. Like was
I
okay
didn't say
is
that.
no, it's
Ah,
in the
okay.
comment. It's in the comments.
Okay.
And the Russia in the years immediately, the USSR in the immediate years following the Russian Revolution was an eldritch horror show. They had like a group called the Legion of the Militant Godless. That was, it was uh, an official state organization backed by, you can probably guess who, and their whole goal was to ferret out believers in Christianity and turn them into the state and get them killed. And it was just a truly awful place to live. Was Russia after the collapse of the USSR worse than like Brezhnev era USSR? Yeah, that's true. But just like it's hard to say how much of that is a result of the dissolution of the USSR and how much of it is just the continuation of a downward trajectory that the USSR was already on. It may have been arguably could have been heading back for a trough in the 90s. Anyway, I don't know. That's an
Yeah.
interesting observation, though.
Yeah. Kind of going onto that a bit more. So basically, what the research showed, and why I got interested in the topic in the first place, was when the natural trust structure of the family dissolves, and this really it builds a lot on the concept of trust and on the concept of social capital. When the natural trust structure of the family dissolves, people are more willing to trust um, strangers. And the reason for that is very simple, and that is we are social creatures, we need connections with others. If we can't get it from a family, we will be way more lenient with strangers and way more willing to trust strangers. So the upside of that is that if you are in what would be called a high trust society, then you can create a lot of, let's say, economically more efficient uh, kind of social structures, because the people you tend to get into contact with are people you will then be able to create what is called social capital with. And social capital is kind of the economical advantage that is performed or generated out of the social bindings and the social structure and the just the social setting basically in your society. Um, of course, you immediately see why it then also correlates with unhappiness, because these relations tend to be more economically minded. You tend to try to keep to yourself in a sense where you more or less start using others or have a higher tendency to use others to achieve your own ends and your own gains. And usually those are in economic. And of course, because you're in a high trust society, the deals you make and the economic uses you make will be such that they are beneficial for both sides. So you end up creating what is called social capital. And then you can kind of see the tragedy playing out from there. These societies get more and more economically viable, and the people who are running them think that what they're doing is very politically and economically astute, that they're very good leadership, and then in the end it kind of erodes from the bottom up. This is happening in every society on Earth at the moment. Everybody is losing birth rates like mad. At the same time, things like abortion, contraception, and divorce are increasing at an unprecedented rate. And what I basically want to point out, and expand onto is in the book will be how these societies develop and what can be expected from them, how they can be prevented, because it is in the end a kind of like it is just a call to death. You basically sacrifice the future of your people for a long-term growth, because long-term in economic terms is only measured for the next 10 years. And after that quote-unquote long-term growth has been achieved, you are unable to grow anymore. And that is, of course, the situation that basically every Western country, except for the United States, is in today.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent summary, and that was one that really want to emphasize the idea of the rise of this concept of social capital as being just a totally, you can minimize it as much as you want to, but the idea that you are in fact what you're essentially doing is financializing quantifying relationships to be bought and sold. And
Yes.
once that idea emerges, no matter how unseriously you take it, you can't ever really it's hard to put that genie back in the bottle. And
Yes.
The consequences can only inevitably be negative.
And so to kind of bind that back into the episode today, I think we really see that in, let's say, almost even accidental form in Prussia and its experience of Protestantism and an experience with pietism, because as we talked about with Franke at length, Franke in the end is an agent of breaking up the family. He is an agent of replacing kind of care, of replacing education, of replacing just taking count and taking care of another person at rough times. He replaces all of that with a state structure that is able to provide all of this, and so it seems to all of the countries in Europe like he kind of cracked the code, and as if Prussia is the future, but we see it more and more morphing into what is basically what basically the 60s decry, and like in the year 2525, or like, well, what's it called, like
What a
25
strange
25.
song! What a strange song for you to
Yeah.
know. That is an obscure one to pick out of the garbage bin. Yeah.
I only know it because I read a book about the Manson murders, and it kind of painted a very good picture of the
Yeah.
60s.
I'm kind of wondering. It's there's a line, and it's like in the year 95. I'm kind of wondering if man is gonna be alive.
Yeah, if man is still alive,
Hmm.
it's if woman can survive, you
Yeah.
may find, and then they have like pills from a like, or like food and pills, and like all the technocratic horror show that we're witnessing today. And the important notion for this that our storytelling sadly doesn't contain, or history doesn't contain, and even our understanding of social science or social theory doesn't contain, even though it's in there, which is the big irony, is that all of this is basically just the inheritance of liberalism, which starts in the development of Protestantism, and the idea that, well, basically everybody can be their own pope. Afish in chat says, quantifying all relations to be bought and sold, cryptos be like. Yeah, pretty much. Okay, I think we are 1.5 hours in. I think this is a good place to break it off. I think we're just rambling at this point. I think I brought everything up I wanted to bring to the table. Christopher, do you have anything?
No. I thought it was good. An hour and a half is about as long as anyone can expect it to be pay attention. I told you we used to do 3 hours, and nobody listened to the
Yeah.
last. Nobody ever listened to the last 1.5. If you go 3 hours, you have to make sure that you're going to put everything that you want people to hear up in the very beginning, and then you just use the last hour and a half to gossip about people you don't like.
We should do that. We should start gossiping. Do you have anybody you don't like? No, I'm joking. Okay, then I hope everybody who watched this enjoyed it. It was a lot of chatting today. It's very nice to see. And I will see you guys in the next part, which will be coming out in, I don't know, because I'm very busy at the moment. Bye-bye.